This is Stories of Impact, the art and science of human flourishing. In every episode, we travel the world to explore intersections of science and spirituality. I'm your host, writer Tavia Gilbert, and along with journalist Richard Sergey, every first and third Tuesday, we look through a new lens at old traditions, hear from new generations as they dream up innovative solutions, and learn new ways to make sense of modern life. Did you know that you are part of one of the most significant revolutions in the last 85 years? If you're one of the 180 million Americans in the labor force, and at some point since the 2020 pandemic, you joined the ranks of work from home, you are historically revolutionary. And Dr. Nicholas Bloom has the data to prove it.
The increase in working from home from the pandemic is probably the largest change to the labor market since World War II. It is hard to think of anything that is greater.
Dr. Bloom is an economist and a Stanford University professor of economics. He's been collecting data on working from home for over 20 years, well before the 2020 pandemic, well before working from home was really a thing. What's happened to labor in the U.S. and globally in the last 5 years is as significant a shift as anything since 1941.
So World War II was enormous because so many millions of men went off to fight. Women were called into the workforce, and lo and behold, what seems obvious now but wasn't back then is, look, women can do as good a job or a better job than men. And that stuck, and that was part of the major transformation of the labor force. The pandemic has had a similar impact. Because we had to, because of lockdowns, we all shifted into work from home. It wasn't perfect, but we realized it was a lot better than we thought, and chunks of it have stuck. Most people are no longer fully remote. We've not gone back, though, to 2019. We're not gone back to 2020. We're in this intermediate hybrid form, where we're in 3 days, typically, and at home 2 days. And that is an absolutely massive revolution, which has affected everything: cities, sports, real estate, crime, taxes, politics, all kinds of things.
Until the eve of the pandemic, says Dr. Bloom, the idea of work from home was met with a lot of skepticism, seen as a fringe activity at best. In fact, he says,
I gave a TEDx talk in 2017 on it, and you'd hear the phrase a lot, shirking from home or working remotely working, because people were so skeptical that you actually did any work. Suddenly, early to mid-March 2020, my phone, my email, everything just went ballistic because, of course, suddenly we were all working from home. So if you just look in the data, there was a 10-fold increase in the number of days work from home. And your typical graduate professional before the pandemic working from home an average 1 day a month. And by April 2020, were typically working fully remotely. It's a complete change.
April 2020 saw dramatically fewer international workers commuting to work, as they had for almost 300 years prior.
So the Industrial Revolution started about 1750, 1760, 1770 in England, actually. So before then, home was your village, and you'd probably work from there and you'd farm the fields, or maybe an artisan. And then once industrialization started, that was the first time we really had mass commuting. The reason was, of course, you have to create factories, and factories work best at scale. So it's more effective to have a factory with, say, 1,000 people working in it. And so if you have 1,000 people working in a factory, you can't all live nearby. And so you start to get the modern commute. And that just grew and grew and grew until I would say the zenith was at 2019, when we know in the US, 93% of days were worked on business premises, only 7% of days were worked from home. What was that 7% before the pandemic? It was a few folks in things like call centers, data entry.
And Dr. Bloom seized the opportunity to study the revolutionary impact of work from home on the global and U.S. economy.
So we were interested on what's the impact of work from home on the U.S. economy and actually globally. As an academic, you spend your life searching around for data sets to try and figure out the impact of this. This data doesn't exist. So the first bit of science you have to do is actually just collect data.
There was plenty of data measuring unemployment, wages, and prices. But Dr. Bloom wanted to understand work from home's impact on office prices, crime, sports, employment, disability, and more. He surveyed 10,000 people between the ages of 20 and 64 who had earned $10,000 or more in the prior year, asking them,
Are you going into the office? Are you working from home? Are you at a ski resort, out in the countryside, whatever it is? We ask them all kinds of background details, what they want, what they're doing. Are they married? Do they have kids? Turns out Americans are never far from their cell phones. So if you can track somebody's phone, you can track them. That has been really valuable for building up a very detailed picture of it. We also have some incredible other data from things like United States Postal Service change of address, Zillow on property prices. I have data from satellites and GPS and how many people are playing golf.
Ever since the pandemic, says Dr. Bloom, golf venues, well, they're
just rammed maximum capacity every day, day in, day out.
How do people see working from home today?
So now in 2025, what we see is work from home is a bit of a perk, and it's actually seen, if anything, as an executive perk. Lower paid frontline workers don't get to do it. And that's a 180-degree change from something that people are a little bit embarrassed about before the pandemic to now something that managers and professionals are kind of happy to show off about because it's a perk and a status symbol.
The data shows that supporting hybrid work has a lot of benefit for employers.
Quit rates fell by 35% for the people allowed to work from home 2 days a week. And they said, well, why not? You're saving us an hour 20 a day for 2 days a week. That's a lot of time and it's very valuable. And so the company looked at this study and said, look, every person that quits costs us $30,000 to $50,000 because they got re-interview, re-recruit, re-advertise, retrain. It takes 3 to 6 months to get them up to speed. They said it's hugely profitable operating hybrid. And that's kind of the strapline why 80% of Fortune 500 companies currently have hybrid for professionals and managers. It's because it's very profitable.
There has been a push to get people to come back into the office. Is that because of the negative impacts of work from home on people's mental health? Not exactly, says Dr. Bloom.
On loneliness and mental health and actually physical health, we're in better shape than we were in 2019 or 2020. I occasionally hear CEOs claim, we're forcing everyone back in the office for mental health. That's a made-up excuse. It's not a social movement. It's not the CEOs thinking, I want to do this for the good of society or for the good of my employees. They're basically saying, I care about shareholder value, I care about profits, and hybrid turns out to maximize that.
The data shows that hybrid work has been really good for problem solving and for creativity.
The best way to be creative and innovative is to have a mix of in-person time and quiet, kind of deep reflection time. So there's actually a paper in the Proceedings of National Economy and Sciences that talks about bursting. And it does this experiment where it gets teams to try and solve something called the traveling salesman problem, which is a classic kind of n-dimensional algorithm problem. And it has 3 teams. So the teams of type A are all pushed into a room for 6 hours and told just to get on with it and solve it. You can imagine lots of whiteboard and discussions and talking. Team B is told all to split up for 6 hours, and at the end, they're going to come together for 10 minutes and collate and then provide their decision. Team C is given an hour together, an hour apart, an hour together, an hour apart, etc. Turns out Team C does by far the best. You want some time together to kick ideas around, but you also want some quiet time to reflect.
The success of work from home has been largely dependent on technology. And tech will drive the future of labor too, says Dr. Bloom.
Back in 1965, 0.5% of days were work from home, like hardly any. Who was that? Presumably a few farmers. Who's doing it in 1965? Hardly anyone. What you see is roughly every 15 years it doubles. What's going on? Well, the technology is getting better. So, for example, in the 70s, phone calls became a bit cheaper, so it's somewhat easier to connect by phone. In the 80s and certainly 90s, you have the spread of personal computers that are cheap enough to have at home in the office. By the 2000s, we got the internet pretty critically for the lockdown, actually. In the 2010s, we got cloud computing, which means we can share files, which is really essential, and video calls, which means you can do things like share screens. So that technology has been critical and has been pretty much the only driving force pushing up work from home. It's been roughly doubling every 15 years until the pandemic. Looking ahead, this is going to continue. One of the big drivers, of course, there are more people now working from home. So when I talk to folks in Silicon Valley, they're like, this is now a big market. There's a lot of money if you can come up with a good new piece of software, hardware, video camera, screen, whatever to service this, because there's now many millions of people doing it. So this is why I think it's a very easy prediction to make that as connectivity and technology gets better, we're going to have higher levels of work from home than we do now because the technology's improved, because a lot of office leases have expired, because younger folks are more into remote. There's various factors that mean the long run work from home levels are clearly going to rise. That's a very easy prediction to make.
What else can Dr. Bloom tell us about the future of work?
Fully in person, currently the biggest group at 60%. That is slowly going to shrink as more and more jobs can be done remotely. Physicians, doctors. Pre-pandemic, you always went in. Nowadays, many of them will have one day of telemedicine. Why? Because actually patients like it as much as the doctor. Another example I think is quite ingenious is fast food. So you'd initially think for fast food, how can anyone work remotely in McDonald's or KFC, etc.? Well, it turns out in the drive-thrus, when you go to fast food drive-thrus, the first thing you do is you roll down your window and you shout into that little speaker thing to make your order. Now, it used to be in 2019, the person taking that order was sat in the cabin 20, 30 feet down the driveway. But companies figured out they don't need to be there because all they're doing is typing the order into a computer that someone else cooks. So now you can have, say, McDonald's has an order taking center in Mississippi where thousands of people are either working from home or in a big call center and they're doing it globally. So technology is slowly going to shrink fully in-person jobs. On fully remote, at the other end, I think that group is also somewhat at risk from offshoring and AI. So if you're fully remote, you don't need a physical presence, and it's going to get increasingly easy for AI. So if you're in a call center, there's much more chatbots or, more advanced AI things, or, it's going to be moved to South America. So the group that's going to grow, I think, is going to be hybrid. So hybrid, I see, is very much the growth group.
So most people will work in the office 2 or 3 days a week and work from home 2 or 3 days a week. How much you want to be in the office really depends on your demographics, says Dr. Bloom.
Men or women with children under the age of 12 have quite a bit higher preference to work from home. When you go to kind of 50 plus, you start to head back into kind of empty nesters.
Age 22 or 62 are the most office-focused, says Dr. Bloom. He breaks this down further.
Group one are like my students at Stanford, early 20s. They want to go into the office 4, maybe 5 times a week. They say, I want to get mentored. I'm going to do it much better in person. It's more sociable. And they also say, look, I'm living in an apartment with 4 friends. Like, where am I going to work from home? I don't want to be in my bedroom all day. It's depressing. So there's one group that wants to come in every day. They're about 20%. There is a second group at the exact opposite that want to work from home every day. They tend to be 30s and 40s with young kids living maybe 45 minutes to an hour from the office. And if you interview them, they'll say, look, I have a great home life. I have my kids, my spouse, friends, a lot going on in my neighborhood. I know my colleagues, I see them sporadically. I don't want to be forced to go in, and it spends an enormous amounts of time in a grueling, unpleasant commute. And it doesn't help my mental health at all. I'm tired and I'm depressed. They're much better being allowed to work from home. They're about 30%. And then the biggest group at about 50% wants hybrid. So they want to go in 2-3 days a week and work from home 2-3 days a week. So choice is actually pretty essential.
What has Dr. Bloom found most interesting in the data?
We see a big shift from city centers out to the suburbs. You are living in New York, say you're working for Goliath National Bank. 2019, you have to go in all 5 days a week. Now, suddenly you're allowed to work from home Monday and Friday. What do? You think, well, I need a bit of space at home, maybe for a home office. Maybe I'd like some space in the backyard for my kids to play, etc. And so you move out to the suburbs. We've seen about 1 million Americans leave city centers of big cities. In many parts of New York, San Francisco, Chicago, suburbs have almost doubled in price. So we've seen a huge migration of Americans out to the suburbs, pushing up suburban prices, actually pushing down, to some extent, city center prices. Second big finding we've seen is there's been an enormous increase in the employment of Americans with a disability. Work rates for people with a disability has absolutely surged, and it looks like work from home is driving a lot of this. There are about 30 million Americans with a disability, like a back issue, vision, hearing, they're in a wheelchair, etc. More than half of them are above 50. So this is an enormous number of Americans. Only 20% of them currently work, at least up until the pandemic. So you're looking at tens of millions of Americans, typically that would like to work, but because of disability issues can't. And that's obviously really bad for them, but it's also really bad for the rest of us, because if those folks can work, they provide goods and services to keep inflation down, they pay taxes. It's a win-win to enable folks with a disability to work. Everyone gains. So that's a second huge benefit for all of us. Third finding is we've seen a big reduction in journeys. This benefits everyone. If you're working from home and not driving in to, say, Chicago, my journey in is a little bit faster because the millions of journeys that folks are not taking, it has increased traffic speeds, particularly on Monday, Friday. It has obviously reduced pollution, reduced accidents. So there's another major social benefit.
Still, not everyone has been able to work from home.
So in our data, 60% of people are not working from home at all. Have they lost out from this? They appear like they've gained as well. Gained in terms of less congestion commuting in. They've gained because folks that are working from home are seeing higher work rates. For example, people with a disability, people are retiring later. So they're paying more taxes, which means there's more money for everyone. The other way they've gained is a bit more subtle, but it's worth explaining a slight history of the labor market. If you look in labor markets, we see rising inequality from 1980 to 2019. So inequality in the US was rising and rising and rising for decades. And it's part of the Occupy Wall Street movement, part of the top 1%. There are a lot of complaints about inequality was going up. Quite amazingly, from 2020 to 2023, inequality in America actually fell. So incredibly, folks working in, say, Starbucks or McDonald's saw faster wage increases than, say, in Google or Facebook. Now, why is that? It looks like the driver of that is changes in labor supply. So if you work in McDonald's or Facebook in 2021-22, it's not a very pleasant setup. You're facing infection risk. That period you have to mask. You certainly don't get any nice work from home perks. If you work in Google or Meta, you get to work from home 2 days a week. Most people report in surveys that's worth like 5 to 10% of a pay increase. More people want those jobs, more people apply for those jobs, and that in a market tends to push down wage increases. So what we've seen since 2020 is folks that cannot work from home have seen their pay rise by about 10% faster than folks that can. And that basically offsets the amenity value, the perk value of being able to work from home.
Dr. Bloom offers one more work-from-home benefit that some of us have enjoyed.
Office buildings, these are now empty on Mondays and Fridays, so their capacity utilization is down. There's got a lot more wasted space with empty offices and heating and air conditioning on. In reverse, there's other things like golf courses, gyms, hair salons, dentists, shopping malls that are now more busy during the week, and so capacity is used better. This, oddly, in some ways, has been a big benefit for all of us.
But the pandemic work-from-home shift has left some people out in the cold.
The biggest losers from work from home, one is folks that own office real estate. The amounts of money they have lost is probably hundreds of billions of dollars. So if you own office buildings, particularly office buildings built after World War II, in the center of big US cities, you've probably lost quite a bit of money. The reason is buildings built in 1910, 1920 required daylight to light the offices because it was before mass electrification. And they end up being very easy to convert to apartments. So if you have a tall, skinny building, you can, split it up into a bunch of apartments. Apartments need windows in most rooms, but it's easy if you have a tall, skinny office building. If you have an office building that's built in 1960, these are like these massive slab-like things with huge floors, 20, 30,000 square foot floors, hardly any windows. In the middle, there's typically 2 bathrooms. They're a nightmare to convert. If these things are empty in city centers, what are you going to do with them? Turns out a lot of them are now being sold for kind of the land value minus scrap. So one group, and you can think of it as some rich families, investors, maybe some of us, if you hold office building in your portfolio, have done badly. The other groups that are upset by lost out is big city mayors, because what you see is activity shifted from the city center out to the suburbs. As a result, it's not that business is gone, but it's moved. And big cities tend to have vocal, loud mayors that complain a lot about it, and the suburbs tend not to have that. So that's the other group. So really, I think the main losers are kind of office owners and big city centers.
Even so, says Dr. Bloom, work from home is here to stay.
At some point, if you do something for 3-4 years, it's stuck. And so now in 2025, we are only gone halfway back. Very roughly, there were 7% of days before the pandemic. It peaked at 60%. We've now stabilized down at about 25%. So we're kind of halfway back down. And that's where it looks like it's going to be for the next 5-10 years.
I wonder how history will judge our fumbling national conversation about who is essential, how much the work-from-home transition accelerated artificial intelligence. What is the balance between benefits and drawbacks of technology? What I appreciate the most about Dr. Bloom's work is what surprises him and me. It's hopeful to consider that in the midst of so much uncertainty, transition, and yes, revolution, remarkably positive, unexpected outcomes emerge. I hope that you'll come back in 2 weeks for another new and inspiring episode. In the meantime, please help us make an impact and share the Stories of Impact podcast. I'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch at storiesofimpact.org. This has been the Stories of Impact podcast with an interview by Richard Sergey. Written and produced by Tavia Gilbert for Talkbox Productions. Assistant producer Oscar Falk. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Executive producer Michelle Cobb. The Stories of Impact podcast is generously supported by Templeton World Charity Foundation.